Hey everyone, David Chen here. I'm here today to talk about pop culture brackets and how to fix them. And joining me today on this quixotic quest is TV critic, super intelligent guy, Myles McNutt. Myles, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
Thank you for coming into the environs of my kitchen to talk about this. And we're here today because both of us were enraged by something that we recently saw on the internet. And that was the IO9 sci-fi fantasy pop culture bracket. And this was published by IO9 on their Twitter account, and it asked the question, what's the best sci-fi fantasy film of the last 10 years? Myles, why did this bracket vex us so?
The question of what is the best sci-fi fantasy film, that's an interesting question, right? I'd be curious to see. Lots of interesting films are released in that genre. There are 64 films on this particular list, and in reading through them, I came to discover that my understanding of sci-fi and fantasy was maybe a little bit different than IO9's.
Yeah, some of the choices for what actually qualifies as a sci-fi fantasy film were really, I'm going to just be kind and say suspect. So you got movies on here like Skyfall, like The Muppets, like Inside Out. And at the same time, it's missing movies like Interstellar, right? Which I would argue is a sci-fi fantasy film, more so than The Muppets, slightly, I would say.
Just slightly.
I got so upset about thinking about the rationale behind this list, I started tweeting about it. And Jermaine Lucier from IO9 tweeted back a response to me about how they made their decisions. He said, quote, "We basically define sci-fi fantasy as any movie that has stuff in it that's not possible or doesn't yet exist. That could be tech-based like James Bond or supernatural like Hereditary and includes all animation. It's loose to cover more ground, but yeah, that's the deal." End quote. What bothers me about this definition is that it is unrecognizable by anyone with even a passing interest in movies. I mean, if you ask 10 people on the street, does all animation fit into sci-fi fantasy? No one would say yes. Even people who like barely watch, like go to the movie theater 3 times a year, would not say all animation qualifies as sci-fi fantasy. I would argue.
Even Netflix, who likes to put multiple genres on things so that they come up in multiple categories, would never put all animation under any of
might
those
see like
categories.
Incredibles under like action adventure or something like that.
They're going to spread it out a little bit, but not this much.
Yeah. Where this bracket fails, in our opinion, I think, is in the pool phase, right? Like that the pool of people in, or the pool of elements in the bracket is just not correctly defined.
Right. I don't understand.
Yeah.
I simply do not understand. And that explanation, with all respect to Jermaine, did not help.
What, in your opinion, are some things that all pop culture brackets need if you're going to do it?
I think first you do need a logical pool of contestants,
Yes.
right? That you're pulling from a sort of things that are similar in different ways. And I think I will say the one instinct I liked about the IO9 bracket was the last 10 years component
Yes.
of this. That you're not trying to do all of cinematic history.
Right.
You're trying to say in the last 10 years, what movies really connected with people within a genre space. I think pitting, saying, hey, Mad Max Fury Road versus sort of, you know, any number of other sort of things that happened in the last 10 years, that's an interesting battle. People love that movie, but what happens when it pits against your personal favorite? What if you do like horror more than you like sort of more of the sci-fi action genre? What if you like something sort of more like Interstellar that's less action focused, right, and more philosophical? The idea of having those different battles, I think, would be really smart if we didn't have all of the chaos happening around it. Because at that point, when I first approached that bracket, my immediate response was, what is this nonsense? And some of these battles, I'm like, how is the Muppets in this conversation? The Muppets, nothing in that genre discussion that he just explained explains the Muppets on any level.
Muppets are, it's not possible to have, it doesn't yet exist. Muppets don't exist in our real world yet, so technically it's fantasy.
So we think about the pool structure, it's like you just need to sort of choose. So if it's the last 10 years, great. Anything, you want to limit your pool.
Yeah, add smart constraints.
Right.
Okay, that's number one.
Yes.
Number two, seating.
Correct.
Seating is extremely important, and there's multiple elements to seating that we need to get right. Yeah. What are some of them?
So first off, the reason why there is seeding is because people need to understand why something is against something else. Seeds allow you to sort of get to a point where you start with matchups that might seem easy, although not for all people. People have different opinions. But then you gradually get more into it, and you get the top seeds against each other. It builds momentum. It builds expectation. It builds a sense of hierarchy that you can then sort of play with, confront, agree with, and then sort of work through it. And I feel like there's legibility to that that's really crucial.
You want your seeds to set up exciting conflicts, right? And not just conflicts in the first seed. You want there to be future conflicts that you can imagine that will be really interesting.
I think that's really critical. And I think this goes to, obviously, we're talking about something built around sports, for something built around tournaments and thinking ahead. And you're imagining, what if those one seeds compete against each other? What if those best teams in either circumstance end up all in the final round? And I feel like having the seeding makes sense to sort of understand, are you rooting for an underdog? Are you rooting for the overdog? Where it's just like, is Mad Max Fury Road, you're just like, you know what, overrated. I'm done with that one seed. The legibility of that, I do think, is really critical to having a conversation in that way.
All right, Myles, you've been talking about seeding and how important it is. Let's talk about an example where the seeding was a little bit lacking. This is a Disney Pixar bracket that was shared widely on the internet. Sorry, we don't know who it was from. If you find out, let us know. I'll put it in the description. This Disney Pixar bracket was something you really didn't like because of the seeds. Now, when I look at this, it doesn't seem too bad from the seeds, right? Like just Lion King versus Tarzan, right? Okay, that kind of makes sense. Princess and the Frog, Lilo and Stitch. Let's keep going. Aladdin versus Hercules. Weird. I wouldn't choose those two necessarily. Mulan, Zootopia. Nightmare Before Christmas and Beauty and the Beast. That one's... Toy Story 1, Toy Story 2... Up and Brave. Okay, so tell us what is it you don't like about these?
Well, there are no seeds.
Okay.
Like, those are not seeds. There's no sense of what is a 1 seed, what is an 8 seed. What is anything? There's no logic.
Okay.
They're completely random. And in being completely random, I'm trying to understand, like, what are they trying to accomplish?
Right.
And it's like some of the matchups I think sort of make sense. But like you have The Incredibles against WALL-E here on the bottom right of the Pixar bracket.
Two films that are widely considered some of the best of the Pixar works, right?
And it's like, well, why are we doing that in the first round, right? Like, why are we forcing people to immediately confront? And what bothered me was that people would sort of just be like, they'd get into it and they'd be fighting and it'd be like, scrawling in their own examples, and this kept spreading everywhere. And it kept spreading, and I kept being like, how are you submitting yourself to this nonsense? Like, how are you willing yourself into a situation where there is no logic in place?
Okay, so how do I fix this bracket, Myles?
Well, you just erase everything and restart over.
Okay.
Because there's no way to fix something where there's no logic to refer to, right?
What logic would you use?
So in this circumstance, first of all, Nightmare Before Christmas is not a Disney animated feature.
Yeah.
That was released by Touchstone Pictures, and as a result, does not qualify.
Agreed.
Up front, we need to go with this right now. Fundamental pool issue moving through.
Yeah.
The second issue is sort of trying to understand that, okay, we understand things are 1 seeds or something else, right? We want to seed them. But we can't just do that on feel. And if you create a seeding system that's just your gut feel, where it's like, I feel The Incredibles is a 1 seed, and then it's like, what are you basing that on, right? Your opinion, everything else. You don't want to be responsible for this.
Yeah.
So you need data. There needs to be some reason why you're seeding things in a certain way.
Some logic, no matter how tenuous, right?
Correct. And so it doesn't need to be perfect, doesn't need to be objective, but just something you're basing it on in order to sort of create that circumstance.
Yeah.
The other issue I have with seeding here is that I feel like we have Disney and Pixar sort of working together, but it's not a clear sense of like what we're trying to accomplish within that. Is this about Disney versus Pixar? Is this about ultimately pitting like different eras against each other?
Right.
Like, to me, there's some interesting conflicts happening when we deal with animated features in terms of our ages, our relationship with this content, whether we have kids and are like sick and tired of Frozen, and whether this sort of plays out. There's a lot of really interesting dynamics to this, but I don't feel this bracket actually highlights any of those in a particular way. There's no sense of sort of controlling the flow of the bracket, which is what seeds are designed to do, but you can also play around with how you seed things in order to create that kind of conversation.
So we've already spoken about getting the right pool of entrants. We've talked about getting a good seed by using data.
Yeah.
And then the final piece that you just mentioned seems to be have your seeds, have your bracket tell a story.
Right.
Right? It can't just be, let's pit the best against each other. It needs to be like the forces of good versus evil, modernity versus, conservatism, whatever. Like, have some kind of conflict in mind that the bracket is in some way trying to resolve.
Right, such that when you get to the end of the bracket, you have a different bracket than somebody else. Like, very few people are going to have exactly the same bracket when you have this many entrants. But the idea is you can see precisely sort of where you diverged, and you can start to think about why that happened. But I do think that the more coherent the storytelling is, the more when you get to the end of a bracket, you don't feel like you're frustrated by the decisions you had to make. You feel like you learned something about yourself. And I laugh as I say it because it's kind of absurd, but that is how I feel. Like when I want to fill out a bracket like this, I want to feel like I've gone through and explored my personal preferences, right? My taste. That some of those things will be hard, but I want to have been hard for a purpose and not just because the internet wants me to be angry, so I will share their content and ultimately line the coffers of that, wealthy place of digital journalism that's in such a good place right now.
So let's talk about how you fixed this bracket. Right?
I did.
You fixed it. You went through. You did some research, and you made a better version of the bracket. We'll put it up on the screen. So tell us about. I don't want to walk through every single one of these choices,
right,
but kind of tell us about some of your rationale with these choices.
So I had a central rationale of sort of having to rank these, and I went to IMDb rankings, and I want to be very clear. Like, I don't think IMDb rankings are an absolute sort of circumstance. I do not present that as being a valuable subjective measure in any way, but it creates an objective data set that I can use to sort of indicate, generally speaking, an average person on the internet. And so what I did was I ultimately took, on both sides of this bracket, the top 8 from different eras of Disney and Pixar animation and used that to create my seating structure. I then took that and decided that from the very beginning, the first round of the bracket was going to be era versus era. So that within each pool, I would ultimately seed the 1 from one era against the 8 from the other. And then in doing so, it meant that you were constantly seeing these matchups of era versus era from the very beginning, ultimately. And you might have all of the classic Disney Golden Era animation all make out of your bracket, and then they start competing against each other, and that's what you're looking for. But you might discover that you actually really like Zootopia. That movie really connected with you, and that's going to come out of that bracket a little bit stronger than you realized. And then when you get to that second round, it's Zootopia versus Little Mermaid. You have to confront your childhood feelings about that film and how you felt about Shakira's Try Everything. That you need to sort of deal with those sorts of feelings up front, and sort of each level of the bracket sort of contains a different new matchup that puts into question these sort of eras and those challenges.
Understood. Well, this should be the canonical bracket that people use then, and we will put a link to it in the description of this video.
Right, and I mean, I think in doing so, I spent time on this mainly because I felt like when people were sharing that bracket, that ultimately I don't think you leave that feeling good about anything. You just basically end up leaving it with what one am I, right? That when you have randomness, what one is all that matters. You want the conflict, you want the disagreement, but you don't want it to just be about what won.
Yes.
Because if a bracket is just about what won, even in a sporting context, like March Madness, all of those games are really meaningful, right? The different matchups, the upsets, all these different cases. Who wins is meaningful. But I could tell you more about meaningful upset stories from past tournaments than I can about who won every single year.
Right.
And I feel like that's where you want that storytelling to function. That's what's not always present.
Brackets should not only just be a fun side thing, they can also tell you about yourself. So, well, Myles, we've gone through your 3 pieces of advice for how to make a good bracket, but you do have a 4th piece of advice, right? Which is what?
Don't make brackets. And this is, again, so this is my starting point of this whole word of frustration. And I really understand why they're being created. And I do not begrudge sort of internet journalism and websites trying to find a way to capture onto trends, to play with the kind of theme of March Madness, to find ways to take something that is often very sort of masculinized sports culture and find a way to extend it to different audiences, whether in the same way that they do Bachelor Fantasy League, like it's the NFL. Pop culture brackets allow something that can often be exclusionary to nerds and geeks and people who might not love sports in the same way. They get to participate in the culture. That's wonderful. But we are pitting art against each other in these arbitrary contests, particularly if we're not seating properly and not creating those circumstances. It's we're creating these arbitrary arguments about what is best. And at the end of the day, it's on the IO9 bracket, there's a good 5-6 movies there where I'm those are all great. Why do I have to decide which one is better? Why do I need to create a hierarchy? I also hate lists, so this is not just a bracket related thing. I just feel a lot of the ways in which we want to have these arguments is, and that's part of why in telling this story, it's I want us to have these different senses, what do we prefer, right? What do we sort of connect with? Not what is the best, but what are our preferences? What is our taste? And ultimately, to me, that's the more interesting question, not what is best. And I feel brackets tend to lean into that question in ways that, to me, just burn it all to the ground. That being said, end of day, I get why they're there, and we can try to make them as best as we can. But if you really don't have to, just don't.
I mean, I think the words that come to mind are those from the great films of Paul W.S. Anderson. Whoever wins, we lose. And I think we can leave it at that. So, Myles McNutt, thanks so much for joining me today. This has been so much fun. Where can people find your work on the internet?
So they can find, I'm sure, rants about brackets on my Twitter account at MEMLES. That's Meemles, if you ever wonder how it's pronounced. And you can also find me at my blog, cultural-learnings.com, and writing about various TV shows at the AV Club.
Yeah, Myles will be recapping Game of Thrones this year, which is a small indie show on HBO, and that's going to be a big deal. I'm looking forward to reading those recaps. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this video, hit like or subscribe. We take pop culture very seriously here on the Dave Chen YouTube channel. I'll be making a couple YouTube videos per month. You can also find me on Twitter at DaveChenski, and davechen.net/letters is where you can sign up to receive emails from me. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.